Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Lord of the Rings AMA podcast. My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I invite you to ask me anything about Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or anything related to the greater legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I will do my best to give you as in-depth an answer as I can. And if you want to submit a question, you can email me at lotramapod@gmail.com. Now, I'll be honest, I'm running low on questions, so if you have any questions, even if you don't think it would be enough to take up a full episode, send them in. The answer could be more convoluted than you think. And if I get enough short answers, I can put them together into sort of a mailbag type episode. So email lotramapod@gmail.com, just like this week's question asker, Wendy from Warrenville, Illinois. Wendy asks, why do elves and dwarves not like each other? Thank you for that question, Wendy, but I think maybe you understated the level of feeling involved. It would not be a stretch to say that elves and dwarves have a Drake and Kendrick level of beef. It's Taylor and Kanye. It's the Hatfields and McCoys. They do not like each other. They dislike each other so much that they almost derailed the Council of Elrond, the place where they were trying to figure out how to defeat the manifestation of evil in the world. It got so bad during the council that Gandalf had to interrupt and say, if all the grievances that stand between elves and dwarves are to be brought up here, we may as well abandon this council. But since Sauron has already been defeated, I have a little more time to attempt to lay out all of the complicated and fraught history between elves and dwarves in Middle-earth. So let's begin. And we're going to start at the very beginning, which is actually a recap of sorts of last week's episode about the origins of dwarves. Now, in case you missed it, the short version of the story is this. Dwarves were not originally part of Ilúvatar's plan for the world. They were created by the Vala Aule due to his impatience for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, which are elves and men. And Ilúvatar had mercy on Aule for his transgression, for creating things outside of the plan of Ilúvatar, and he granted to the dwarves life. And Aule's children, the dwarves, were in that way adopted as Ilúvatar's children as well. But Ilúvatar warned Aule that there would be strife between the dwarves and the other children of Ilúvatar. And Aule had made the dwarves stone-hard, stubborn, fast in friendship and in enmity. That's how it's described in the Silmarillion. So, in their very nature, dwarves were people you didn't want on your bad side. They can and would hold a grudge. Now, jump ahead many thousands of years, and we get the first meeting between elves and dwarves. And this first meeting was not an auspicious one. In the Silmarillion, we learn about the petty dwarves that were exiles from dwarven kingdoms, and that the first elves, not knowing that these creatures were people, the elves hunted them. Now, they eventually stopped when they met the two dwarven clans living in the Blue Mountains, the Firebeards and the Broadbeams, and they realized dwarves were thinking, speaking people. But by then, the petty dwarves had pretty much sworn hatred on all elves. Now, they did eventually die out, but not before the last living petty dwarf caused the death of many people and irrevocably changed the course of history. But that is all wrapped up in the longest story in the Silmarillion, called the Children of Húrin, and we have enough to talk about today without going into the details of all of that. So suffice it to say, the first meeting of elves and dwarves was not a wild success. The second meeting actually went pretty well. And the relationship between the elves and the dwarves was pretty good for a long time, while Morgoth was imprisoned in the halls of Mandos. And the elves of Belagost and Nogrod in the Blue Mountains entered into Beleriand, at which point the elves realized that the things they were hunting were in fact people, so they stopped hunting them. And I will say that at this first meeting, the elves come off pretty arrogant. The Silmarillion tells us that the Sindar elves in Beleriand named the dwarves the Naugrim, which translates to the stunted people, which is pretty rude, and they didn't want to learn the dwarves' language of Khuzdul because they thought it sounded ugly and harsh. And the dwarves were actually kind of okay with this last bit because they wanted to keep their language a secret, and so they learned Sindarin in order to communicate. A trade relationship was established, and the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains created a road that connected Doriath, where Thingol was the king, with the different dwarven clans. Melian the Maya, wife of Thingol, had foresight. She knew that Morgoth wouldn't be chained up forever, and so she urged Thingol to take some precautions. So Thingol hired the dwarves to help create a massive underground city called Menegroth, and elves and dwarves worked together to make a beautiful and safe realm that, thanks to the guidance of Melian, was filled with images of Valinor. And over time, the population of orcs began increasing, and so Thingol asked the dwarves to teach his people how to make weapons and armor to defend themselves. And this relationship between dwarves and elves actually improved further when the Noldor returned to Middle-earth, led by Feanor, to retrieve the Silmarils that Morgoth stole. By the way, I realize that I'm pulling a Tolkien and just throwing out tidbits from the larger story. If you are confused, I would suggest going back to the Elven Explanation Extravaganza episode, where I talk about some of this in a little more detail. And even if you do that and you're still wanting some more explanation, email in, lotramapod@gmail.com. Anyway, the Noldor return to Middle-earth. Feanor, he's actually killed, and his 7 sons create a siege around Angband, which is Morgoth's fortress. And Feanor's son, Caranthir, settled his people nearest to Belegost, and he struck up a friendly relationship with the dwarves there. And the dwarves taught the Noldor much and learned much from them. Feanor, he had 2 half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin. Well, a lot of F names in the family, I guess. Fingolfin led his people back to Middle-earth after being betrayed by Feanor. There's so much drama that happens with the Noldor, and we can't get into it now. Fingolfin led his people back to Middle-earth despite being betrayed by Feanor in the process. But Fingolfin's brother and Feanor's half-brother, Finarfin, he refused to go. He wanted to stay in Valinor. But his children did go. And 2 of those children were his daughter Galadriel and Finrod. Now, Finrod was related to King Thingol, just through marriage. Finarfin had married, I think, somebody who's related to Thingol. I don't have the family tree in front of me, but he was related to King Thingol. And so he visited him in Menegroth, in Doriath, where he was very impressed by this beautiful underground realm that he had there, these caverns. And sometimes later, a few hundred years later, he was warned in a dream by the Vala Ulmo, Vala of the Oceans, that the siege against Morgoth wasn't going to last forever, and he ought to create a secure place for his people. And so Finrod, remembering Menegroth, sought out dwarves to help him create an entire underground kingdom. And together they created the hidden kingdom of Nargothrond, expanding and improving a cave system that the petty dwarves had lived in long before. And Finrod had brought many jewels from Valinor, and he gave them to the dwarves as payment. And the dwarves had so much respect for Finrod that they named him Felagund, which means hewer of caves. And he would often be referred to as Finrod Felagund. That just became his name. And the dwarves, they created a great necklace for him, filled with many jewels that would catch and reflect the light anytime it hit it. And it was called the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves. It's like the greatest thing that had ever been made by any dwarf ever was the Nauglamir. And we will be absolutely coming back to the Nauglamir in a little bit. So it seems like things are actually going pretty well, right? I mean, dwarves and elves, they're getting along, they're trading, they're learning from one another. So where did it all go wrong? Well, it probably first started during the high point of their alliance. The Noldor had fought several battles against the forces of Morgoth as they tried to get into Angband and to break down his fortress and get the Silmarils back. Now, in being elves, these battles were often decades or centuries apart. The war against Morgoth lasted for 500 or 600 years. And the 5th and last great battle that the Noldor participated in would come to be known as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, which translates to the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And in this battle, the siege of Angband was finally broken as Morgoth's forces, spearheaded by Glaurung, the father of dragons, they utterly destroyed the forces of the sons of Feanor. Now by this point, men had arrived in Beleriand, and while many fought with the Noldor, some betrayed them and attacked them from the rear in the middle of this battle. There was actually a good chance that the elves were going to beat Morgoth's forces, but yeah, they got betrayed by men, and it became a whole rout as everything fell apart all around everyone. And in this battle, the dwarves of Belegost stood alone against Glaurung. Glaurung, father of dragons, the first dragon, one of the largest dragons to have ever lived. He didn't have wings. The first dragons didn't have wings. But it's just the dwarves of Belegost against Glaurung. And the dwarves of Belegost, they had these massive battle masks like that went from their head to their feet, and they were fire resistant. And so they encircled Glaurung, and that allowed many of the elves and men to escape. And they started hacking at Glaurung with their axes, and even though Glaurung was heavily armored, the axes of the dwarves of Belegost were just too strong. And so eventually Glaurung starts to flee. And as Glaurung flees, he does one final attack, and the Lord of Belegost, Azagal, was slain as Glaurung fled from these axes. And the dwarves at that moment just stopped their fighting, and they all just lifted up the body of their slain king, and slowly, it says, singing a dirge, they just left the battlefield. And Tolkien says that sight of it was so intense that no one ever even dared to attack them as they left the field. But from that moment on, the dwarves of Belegost had no part in the affairs of men and elves in Beleriand. So that relationship was now broken. Belegost was done with what the elves and men were doing. But that's not animosity. That's just them saying we wash our hands of this whole thing. The real turning point came not long after that. See, a lot of events happened. There's many great heroes. They died, and the Silmarillion is so full of so many good stories. But the most tragic character of Tolkien's entire legendarium, he comes into the scene after the end of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. And his name is Turin Turambar. Now, I do not have time to talk about his story, but where it intersects this story is that eventually the hidden kingdom of Nargothrond was discovered and destroyed by Glaurung. And out of the ruins of Nargothrond, Turin brought the Nauglamir, that necklace of the dwarves that had been gifted to Finrod Felagund. He brought it to Doriath and gave it to King Thingol on his throne in Menegroth. Now, this was done in a really passive-aggressive way. Turin is such a long story. It's epic tragedy. No time to get into that. But the point is, the Nauglamir is now in Doriath with Thingol. And Thingol also had in his possession one of the Silmarils, which had been cut from the crown of Morgoth. Incidentally, it was cut with a dwarven-made blade called Angrist, which could cut anything, could cut iron like cutting through butter. And the Silmaril had been cut from the crown of Morgoth by a guy named Beren, a human who had fallen in love with Thingol's daughter, Luthien, which is arguably the best story in the entire Silmarillion. There is just not enough time. The point is, Thingol had in his possession both the Nauglamir and a Silmaril. And against Melian's advice, he decided he would combine the greatest works of the elves and the dwarves. So dwarves of Nogrod were brought in to do that work. And as they toiled away in a deep cavern in Menegroth, Thingol would just sit and oversee what they were doing. And here is where things start to get dicey. The dwarves would claim that the elves just didn't understand their customs, and that a gift is only given to one person. When that person dies, the gift returns to the givers, and so they said that the Nauglamir belonged to them, and if happened to have a Silmaril attached to it now, well, that was incidental. And the elves would say that the dwarves grew greedy as they looked on the Silmaril and wanted to steal it. And alone in the caverns, Thingol and the dwarves argued. And no one can say who started the violence, but the end result was that Thingol, the king, was slain, and the Nauglamir with the Silmaril was taken by the dwarves as they raced back to Nogrod. But they were pursued and overtaken, and almost all of the dwarves that were there were slain, but 2 escaped and returned to Nogrod, and they riled up their people, saying that they were unjustly attacked. And so the dwarves of Novgorod attempted to form an alliance with the dwarves of Belagoth, but Belagoth dwarves, they refused. They said, we're not doing this. So alone, the dwarves of Novgorod sent an army to Doriath. And in what was known as the Battle of the Thousand Caves, elf and dwarf slaughtered one another. But with Thingol dead, Melian, the queen, she, being a Maya, she could choose to live in her body or become a spirit again. When Thingol died, Melian just left her body and returned to Valinor as a spirit. And so the Sindar elves, they were leaderless, and the dwarves prevailed and looted the treasuries and took back the Nauglamir. But the force that went back, there was so much death in that battle, it was a depleted force. And another elven army intercepted them, led by Beren, who I mentioned before, and in another battle, the Battle of Sarn Athrad, which is just like a river ford, took place. And Beren and the elves were victorious, and they were aided by Ents, who came out of the forests and drove the dwarves into the rushing river. And the forces of Novgorod were decimated, and their kingdom never recovered. And at the end of the First Age, the Valar sent an army from Valinor to finally defeat Morgoth. And in that process, the land of Beleriand was utterly destroyed, and it sunk beneath the waves of the ocean. And the resulting devastation weakened the dwarven realms of the Blue Mountains even further, and while some remained all the way in the Blue Mountains through the Third Age, they stayed there thousands of years, the vast majority of the survivors fled into the east, and they joined with the Longbeards in Khazad-dûm in the Misty Mountains. So that by itself could be enough to explain the history of the elves and the dwarves, but unfortunately their strife continued. As the Sindar elves migrated east, they discovered that the dwarves who slaughtered their people in Beleriand had joined with the Longbeards, and so they didn't trust them at all. Now you may remember some of that from our episode on why the elves live where they do. Orifer, which is Legolas' grandfather, he had moved his people away from Khazad-dûm as they gained strength because he didn't want those dwarves messing with his stuff. And Celeborn, remember, he refused to even travel through Khazad-dûm when Galadriel left Eregion because he viewed them as the murderers of his people. And he was a direct relative of Thingol the king, so he had this special hatred for them. Now, the Noldor in the Second Age weren't as prejudiced toward the dwarves as the Sindar were, and the Noldoran settlement of Eregion made a close alliance with the dwarf of Khazad-dûm. But when Sauron's forces destroyed Eregion, Durin's folk closed their doors and locked themselves away. Now, they did send troops to fight with men and elves in the War of the Last Alliance, Isildur cutting the ring off of Sauron's hand, but it seems likely that Sauron also had dwarves from the east fighting on his side, and so the elves are seeing that some dwarves helped us, but some dwarves helped the enemy. Now, the last big rift occurred when the dwarves awoke the Balrog in the Third Age of Middle-earth. As I mentioned in a previous episode, when they awoke the Balrog, it caused the destruction of Khazad-dûm, and Durin's folk, that's what they called themselves, the Longbeards were Durin's folk, they scattered. And when they did that, orcs began attacking the woods outside of Lothlorien, a place filled with Sindar and elves that already distrusted the dwarves, and it directly led them to losing their king, Amroth. And so the elves around Lothlorien, for a variety of, multiple reasons. The Sindar had come in and they said, those dwarves, you're harboring dwarves that killed our king. And then the dwarves woke the Balrog, and so the security of Lothlorien was upended, and they lost their king. They, especially the dwarves around Lothlorien, especially do not like dwarves. Now, in the Hobbit movies, they try to show Thranduil's distrust of the dwarves of Erebor due to a special necklace that belonged to his mother, and blaming that they had in Erebor, and blaming him for the dragon and all that. Now, the first part was entirely made up for the films. It's kind of, they were referencing the Nauglamir, but not, they couldn't say it, so that was just added to give some more personal thing. But it is very likely, I find it very realistic, that Thranduil would absolutely blame the dwarves for Smaug coming in and attacking Erebor and upending there had been this little culture there. There we see trade between the woodland realm and the men of Long Lake. And so all of that was upended and disrupted when Smaug attacked. And so it would be perfectly natural for Thranduil, who already doesn't like dwarves, to just add that to the tally of you guys brought the dragon here to our realm. So all told there, that is a lot of history between elves and dwarves throughout the entirety of Middle-earth. And while it may seem like, okay, over 7,000 years had passed between the death of Thingol and the Council of Elrond, where I started this episode, surely they could have dropped it. But remember two things. One, elves are immortal. And two, dwarves were literally made to hold grudges. Celeborn lived in Doriath, and it's very possible he fought the dwarves in the Battle of the Thousand Caves. And Aule's desire for the dwarves to be stubborn meant they couldn't let it go, especially if they believed they were in the right. Now, I'm not going to make a judgment call, since the Silmarillion is written from the elvish perspective, and has a very pro-elf slant in this particular area. If we read the history of the dwarves, I'm sure it would say something very different. But knowing all of this background, it makes the friendship that develops between Gimli and Legolas all the more significant. They weren't overcoming some minor petty feud. They were overcoming thousands of years of ingrained hatred and violence, representing perhaps a restoration of the alliance that had once existed in the twilight of Beleriand before the sun and moon when the world was young. It's usually my intention with this podcast to just give you a bunch of fun lore, background information, stuff that helps explain the motivations for stuff that's going on behind the scenes in the books and the movies. But this whole week, as I was putting this together and researching it, I could not help but see reflections in our world today. Ancestral memory and hatred, all sides believing firmly that they are right and the other side is wrong. And we don't have the manifestation of evil of Sauron in our world, but we have other evils. We have famine and disease. We have dying children and lives torn apart by violence. Things that we could be fixing, but we focus instead on attacking one another because we're right and they're wrong. And maybe one side is right, maybe one side is wrong. But our focus on the evil we do to each other is preventing us from actually solving the evils in this world that we can solve. I think the point of fiction is that it shows us how our world is. Just your run-of-the-mill fiction is, this is what our world is like. The point of science fiction, it shows us what the world might be or what it could become if things keep going as they are or if we adopt certain technologies. But I think why I love fantasy is because I think the point of fantasy is it shows us how the world should be. Gimli and Legolas, they were people who had every right to hate each other. Absolutely every right to despise one another for what their families had done to each other's families thousands of years in the past. I mean, they every right to do that. But they were able to overcome that, to put that aside and figure out how they could do good in this world, in Middle-earth, and actually try to improve things for everyone. To start a new path forward to make their world a better place. And I think our world could use some Gimlis and Legolases. Well, there you go, Wendy. I hope that answered your question about why the elves and dwarves dislike each other. I wasn't planning on moralizing at the end there, but that's the beauty of good literature. It should stir up some response within you. Now, I don't think I'll end every episode like that, but I definitely can't promise I'm not going to do it again. And if you, like Wendy, would like to submit a question, you can email it to lotramapod@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to answer it. And if you want to, feel free to leave a 5-star review, tell a friend, all that stuff that gets the word out about the show. It Genuinely, it does make a huge difference getting this in front of people. Follow me on Instagram and Threads. Links for both are in the show notes. Thank you as always to Michael for our music and Lauren for our artwork. And that is all for this week. Iluvatar willing, I'll be back next week. See you then.